Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll wait for a few more people to jump on, but we are very thrilled to have you with us this morning. I'm Chris King, the president of the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia. If you're not familiar with DemBiz, we are a membership organization at the intersection of business and progressive politics. You can learn more about us and become a member yourself at www.dembiz.org. That's DEMBIZ.org. And if you've been following DemBiz's online programs since this coronavirus crisis began, you know that we're doing everything we can to bring you the best and most updated information regarding the crisis, especially with regard to business and the economy. And to that end, we are thrilled to welcome back a longtime friend of DemBiz, Virginia's outstanding 11th District Congressman, Gerry Connolly. Congressman Connolly, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know you're being pulled in a lot of different directions these days.
My pleasure, Chris. Great to be with you. And I'm so glad so many people have signed up for this webinar. We're all trying to handle technology in ways of communicating, and I think this is a great one. So delighted to be with you.
All right, fantastic. And so for those of you who don't already know, Congressman Connolly has served in Congress since 2009. He is a member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, as well as the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. So he's definitely in the room, as it were, on a lot of these issues that we're going to be talking about. Brief comment about the way this next hour or so will go. I'm going to ask some questions to the Congressman initially, and then we'll open it up to questions from you, the viewer at home. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and click on that. If you have a question, go ahead and write it in, and then I will choose questions as we go along over the course of the next hour. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. Congressman Connolly, if you could just give us kind of a brief overview of where things are at today with regard to COVID-19 and especially with regard to business and the economy.
So I think we're at really a cataclysmic point in American history, both in public health and in economic distress. So we have a pandemic for which there's no treatment and no cure and no prophylactic, no vaccine. That is terrifying. It has a high mortality rate. If you look at official statistics, it looks like it's 4 to 5%. Now, when all the numbers are finally counted, it's going to be lower than that, but it's a much higher mortality rate, especially among older citizens than, say, the flu, much higher, maybe by a factor of 10 or more. So we obviously had been deeply concerned that as this pandemic spread, more and more cases identified, that hospitals would be overwhelmed. Except for New York City and some other places around the country, so far, that has not happened. So the surge capacity we built into hospitals by emptying them out of sort of elective surgeries or early release to free up bed space and so forth actually turned out to be a wise move, and we seem to have enough capacity. What we didn't have enough of were test kits to test people, and we still don't have them. And that, in part, is because of some bad decisions made by this administration. One was to allow the supply chain for both test kits, ventilators, and what's called PPE, protective personal equipment, masks, gloves, surgical gowns, to disproportionately rely on China as a supplier. So when this outbreak began, of all places, in China, in Hubei province, especially in the city of Wuhan, obviously China wanted to keep that equipment for its own crisis. And so in addition, the administration was very late in recognizing this was serious. In fact, as you know, the president poo-pooed it, dithered, delayed, denied. There was only one case that was going to go down to 0. We're going to get over this quickly. Anyone who wanted a test could get one. All patently false statements. And we wasted 70 days where we should have been getting prepared and could have prevented. Yes. and infections. And we did. So we're in a period where we're rushing to catch up. And there's a lot we still don't know. We don't know if, in fact, if you were exposed to the virus or, in fact, came down with the illness, whether after you recover, you're immune, or can you get reinfected? We don't know that. We're hoping it's the former. But if it's the latter, then a lot of the promise we're hoping with respect to antibodies and herd immunity and all that sort of thing, that promise may not be fulfilled. And that's kind of terrifying to contemplate too.
Sure.
We know it's highly infectious. And that's why social distancing right now is the only way to limit its spread. On the economic side, Chris, we just saw the numbers released this morning. Another 3.8 million Americans filed for unemployment last week. That means we now have an unemployment number officially of 30 million people during this pandemic. That is depression level. That's the largest number in such a brief period of time of Americans ever in American history, including the 1929 crash, to file for unemployment. And so we're the official number for the first quarter masks what has been happening. So we saw yesterday that the official decline in GDP was 4.8%. I guarantee you in the next quarter, that will be somewhere north of 15 to 20%.
Wow.
And unemployment's going to be somewhere between 20 and 30% of the entire American workforce. So
that's unbelievable.
With that collapse, it has ripple effects for everybody on this call and every American, but certainly every business. And that's what we're trying to staunch and stabilize through a series of bills in the Congress.
Okay. Well, so as we kind of dive deeper into that economic and legislative part, so the Paycheck Protection Program, obviously big picture, the CARES Act was passed, $2.2 trillion deployed. The Paycheck Protection Program, the first tranche had $349 billion. That was exhausted in 13 days. And many of the businesses that needed it didn't get it for various reasons. It could have been loopholes. There were some public companies that snatched up some of that money. There was an incredible logjam at the Small Business Administration. And then we had banks that weren't used to administering that kind of volume that were kind of thrust into the role of doing that. So now we've got another, I've seen conflicting reports on the number, but it looks like about 310 billion that has been injected into the PPP as a second tranche or as another tranche. What changes have been made that small business owners can maybe count on that are different than the first tranche?
So with respect to the first tranche, I was not happy with the haste, which was understandable because of the immediacy of the crisis, and what we were asking us, really a very modest sized agency, namely Small Business Administration, to handle. So in roughly 2 weeks, they were expected to manage a volume of loans, or a dollar volume of loans, sort of the equivalent of 10 years of their normal lending.
Jeez. And
they weren't set up for that kind of volume. They had a lot of trouble with their own technology as a result in terms of the flood of applications. And of course, they didn't have enough time to sort of spread the wealth, to get new financial institutions into the game and lending at the local level. Community development banks, credit unions, small regional banks that aren't normal SBA lenders, but we wanted them to become lenders so that we, in fact, had a fighting chance to reach the mom and pops, the small retails, the small family-run law firms, whatever. Of course, what happened was SBA allocated fairly large sums of that first $350 billion for their normal big bank lenders. And the big bank lenders did what they normally would do, right? They go to their preferred customer list and start with them. And as a result, a lot of small businesses who were the attendees of benefits were still waiting in line. And the demand was so great, literally $350 billion for small businesses, the biggest pot of money ever created in American history, ran out in 14 days.
Incredible.
So Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, called Speaker Pelosi and said, I need another $250 billion in 48 hours. To her credit, she said, I don't think so. That will come with some strings attached.
Right.
So what we did in the interim, what we call the interim bill, was we ultimately approved that 250, but we added 60 billion specifically targeted to minority, women-owned, veteran-owned, disabled-owned businesses, and absolutely targeted to the small guys. Originally, PPP, which is a creative idea that I think is going to be with us for a while, was intended for businesses with 500 or fewer employees and loans that were forgivable up to $10 million. And the condition of that forgiveness was you keep those people on the payroll. We're trying to prevent more people from being laid off. Now, my experience is things seem, anecdotally, I can only say this based on my own experience in my office, more small businesses seem to be getting through. More of them seem to be getting their applications approved. It doesn't mean there aren't still problems. And in fact, just the other day, SBA's IT system called eTran crashed. So the volume is still very heavy. And my guess is there's going to have to be a third tranche of money. But the whole purpose of this was to save small businesses, not the big guys. And although there have been a lot of stories about the big guys getting help and money, relatively speaking, that's still a small percentage of the total. But it bothers me, and I'm sure it bothers all of you, that they somehow got through the screening process. And you're going to have some problems with this because of the urgency and the time frame. This has not been 6 months of setting up. This has been 6 days. Right. So and the game is be seized with the urgency and magnitude of what we're facing. Don't let it collapse further. And say as many as you can.
I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions, we will be taking those starting in just a few minutes. You can hit the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, write in a question, and I'll be choosing those and forwarding them on to Congressman Connolly. So staying with the PPP, you mentioned banks. Has there been any discussion in the Congress about allocating future tranches to people who didn't get any in the first tranche? It looks like there's just this incredible backlog where even people applying now for PPP money are kind of waiting in line with all the people that applied the first time but didn't get any. So they're still kind of in the queue.
Yeah. Obviously, if the Democrats had a free hand in writing the bill, that would be our target. Those are the people we want to help. We're dealing with a Republican White House and a Republican-controlled Senate, whose predilection, of course, is to help the big guys. We got to protect industries and banks and large franchises and big employers like Boeing to staunch the hemorrhage of unemployment and to preserve those capabilities in the economy. And the Democratic orientation is no. We got to help we got to help those small businesses and small retailers, restaurants, and all that on Main Street. That really ought to be the goal. Don't let them go under, because they collectively account for a huge percentage of the American workforce. Yes, we would absolutely want to do more of that. We did get some of that finally through this last bill, and we're going to try to do more of it. But we don't control the whole process, and that's part of our frustration.
Okay, and we'll have a lot more on the PPP. I think as questions start rolling in, which they are right now, some of those relate to that. But before we do, I want to get to a couple other quick topics. Obviously, Northern Virginia has a tremendous federal workforce that lives there and works there. They don't seem to be getting as much guidance from this administration on how to proceed, what to do, and then there have been charges that those jobs have been politicized and that they, maybe, I don't know, maybe go to administration cronies or similar charges like that. Where are we at with the federal workforce in Northern Virginia right now?
Well, I would agree with the criticism you leveled that the guidance has been all over the place and not helpful. OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, had to issue 5 different memos to clarify the guidance such as it was. And the bottom line really was, you're on your own and don't screw up. And so a lot of managers felt they were duty bound to say to their workforce, you got to come in. Other managers saw the reality and said, look, don't quote me, but stay home, work from home. Now we have an administration backdrop that has been hostile to the federal employee in general, right? So they have no working relationship with union representatives who could be helping them right now. I had a similar kind of webinar with AFGE last week. And I think I talked to AFG reps in about 12 federal agencies. And every one of them complained about the fact that their managers won't even talk to them, the political appointees. So there's no communication line. And what could go wrong with that in the middle of a pandemic?
Right.
And there were a lot of complaints about not being protected at work, not having things like hand sanitizers or masks, and social distancing. Of course, if you're making people come to work in the federal context, you're talking about a lot of people working in cubicles, cheek to job. So there's high risk factor, a lot of fear, lack of guidance. It's been a mess. And then compound that with the fact that the administration launched a real broadside against telework starting 2 years ago. So, and it started with Secretary of USDA, the Department of Agriculture, Perdue, walking around and asked for somebody. And he was told, well, that somebody was teleworking that day. And Perdue didn't like that answer. And so he cracked down on teleworking, reversed their progress, and limited it to no more than 1 a day under strict conditions. And that caught on with other Republican cabinet members. And so Social Security shut down its big pilot telework program that had been working. EPA, Department of Education, HUD, others. And so when the pandemic hit and we desperately needed a robust telework program in place for continuity of operations, we had a clunky one at best, with little guidance and a lot of discouragement, right? So they had a hustle then saying, well, we want people teleworking. Well, I thought you told us you didn't want us teleworking. And oh, by the way, I no longer am set up to be able to do it.
Right.
So the last thing that happened was OPM issued a memo on how to reopen. And if you read that memo, it is a Pontius Pilate memo. It is washing their hands of responsibility and saying the decision should be made locally. And in the context of a rules-based federal employment system, that's no guidance at all. And so federal workers are understandably upset. And I think we have to have some answers from this administration about how incompetently at the federal employment level, and by the way, federal contract employees, don't forget, they work often, they're embedded in federal agencies often, and they have the same kind of quandary, except that if they don't show up for work, if they're expected to, they don't get paid. The contract requires you to fulfill the terms of the contract, which involves showing up. So right. some of them have been able to telework, but some of them, their clients, federal agencies won't let them. So that's also been a confusing element on top of the direct problem with federal employees.
Well, let's hope that situation improves and they get a little more guidance and some fairer guidance. Want to jump to another federal issue, which is the Postal Service, which you are very much involved with. Question here from Catherine Tobin. Congressman, what is the status of the USPS and how will it be saved if it can be saved?
Well, it can be saved and it has to be saved. I am committed to doing everything in my power to do that. We had a 2-part program in the big CARES Act, the $2.2 trillion act that I helped write for my subcommittee. And essentially, it provided debt forgiveness of $11 billion, and secondly, $14 billion infusion of cash to help stem the revenue loss from the pandemic because volume is collapsing. That got to the Republican Senate. The Republican Senate roughly agreed to some of that. And then all of a sudden, the White House indicated the president personally would veto the bill if any of that was in the CARES Act, and so it got stripped out. Now, the president was asked about that because I criticized him, and there was a reporter at one of his press conferences who actually quoted me saying, Congressman Connolly says, you personally, killed the postal relief. And he went off on a tear about package pricing, and that if the post office simply increased the price of packaging delivery, everything would be fine. Now, translation, he thinks the postal office gives Jeff Bezos and Amazon a special deal. It's false. Postal rates are set by the Postal Regulatory Commission by law, not by the president, not by me. And it's a competitive pricing policy with respect to packages. If you start to significantly raise the cost of that delivery, not being mindful of competitive pricing, all you're going to do is drive package delivery to your private sector competition. Now, real briefly about the Postal Service, it has been insolvent for a while. Part of the problem was created in 2006 by Congress in having an onerous prepayment requirement with respect to retiree health benefits that they essentially had to provide in an escrow account virtually 100% of those benefits. Now that's absurd. No entity on the planet is required by federal law to do that except the Postal Service. And so it instantly created a huge debt overhang for them that adds about $5 to $6 billion a year, which they cannot meet. So they have defaulted on that debt for the last few years. Now, interestingly, until the pandemic, if you look at the last 6 operating years of the Postal Service and you took away that owner's prepayment requirement, they were operating in the black. They were actually making a profit. Not a huge one, but a profit. Now, volume has changed because of technology, right? Most of us no longer write mom a letter. We email her. So first-class volume has just declined steadily. In the pandemic, it went from a steady decline to a precipitate decline. So in early March, total volume had fallen about 5.7%. By the end of March, it had fallen 30%. And by July, the total mail volume of the Postal Service will have dropped by 50%. That is to say, we'll be delivering half of the volume we did a year ago. Packages are growing, but they're only 5% of the total volume. Now, even having said that, though, just to show you the magnitude and criticality of the Postal Service, in 1 week, the Postal Service handles more volume than FedEx does in a whole year. And in 1 month, the Postal Service handles more volume than all of its private sector competitors in 1 year. So, and of course, in the pandemic, the Postal Service, the reliability of the Postal Service delivery is critical for prescription drugs, medical equipment, foodstuffs, vital communications, and the like. The reason for the precipitous drop in volume is commercial mail, right? Advertisers, all that, have just dried up entirely. So their COVID-related revenue loss, they're losing about $2 billion a month. And they're estimated to be out of cash by September 30th. And so, the thing we just take for granted every day in the midst of this chaos and shutdown and confusion and anxiety is, but my mail will be delivered every day to every household and every business 6 days a week in America. And I think when people learn, just to give you one more thing, Chris, but when we look at trust, so only 17% of the American people trust government. 74% of the American people trust the Postal Service.
Wow.
It is the highest approval rate of any quasi-governmental or governmental entity in America. And so when people learn it's at risk and that Trump won't help, they get really riled up.
And so what impact might that have on the 2020 election? So this is a question that I was probably going to save for later, but since we're talking about it, the issue of mail-in voting has become prominent, particularly now. So how do you see the election going, and what role might USPS play in that realistically? And especially in light of the losses that you're talking about month over month, when we're talking about an election that's not until November.
Yeah. Well, that's why I want to press for the next bill. We've got to have postal relief in there, whether Trump likes it or not. And I think there are Republicans who get that. And what you're hinting at is this could become a political issue in the campaign. And I think it already is. I think a lot of my colleagues have really been surprised at how powerful public opinion is. And I'll give you my own example, right? So my communications to my office, I would say, depending on the issue, roughly go from 1,500 to 2,500 a week. 2,500 would be kind of high. We're now averaging 5,000 a week. But the number one issue for the last 3 weeks consistently has been postal. Interesting, not PPP.
That is surprising, yeah.
We hear about all that other stuff, but that's the latent support for the public and how easily aroused they're going to be when they learn it's at risk. And I think politicians discount that at their peril. So I think we're going to get relief for the Postal Service in this next bill so that we can get through the pandemic and stabilize the Postal Service. Now, to your question about mail, ballot mail, I have a primary coming up. By the way, everybody on the call could use your support. June 23rd. Well, we can't campaign normally, right? We can't knock on doors. We can't have rallies. We can't have coffees or meet and greets. I can't go to various groups and speak to them. And so everything has to be done remotely or by phone. So that changes how you campaign. But in terms of voting, obviously our strategy is going to be to tell everybody to vote by mail. Please apply for an absentee ballot and vote by mail because we don't want anyone putting themselves at risk on June 23rd. And I believe that is in our future, right? I think this pandemic absolutely tells you that going forward, we want to encourage as many Americans everywhere as possible to vote safely and conveniently. And by the way, we know what that does, right? It tends to make an election process more efficient, more reliable, and expands the franchise. Many more people vote. So that culture can happen very quickly, that cultural change. Look at what just happened in both Ohio and Wisconsin. Despite Republican attempts to suppress the vote by requiring physical voting in Wisconsin, most Wisconsinites actually voted by mail. And in Ohio, literally, they went from the traditional voting system to largely voting by mail in the primary last week, and it worked. So I think that's in our future. The governor definitely is sympathetic to that. But you're right, all of that hinges on a viable, functioning, non-disrupted Postal Service.
Sure.
So here we are asking the Postal Service to take on more responsibility while basically showing them our back in terms of relief. And my view is if we can justify providing relief to the airline industry, which had record profits, unlike the Postal Service, and use those profits to do stock buyback and dividends rather than reinvesting in the enterprise, we certainly can provide a comparable amount of assistance to keep the Postal Service up and running.
Okay, well, let's definitely hope that comes to pass, because vibrant Postal Service, as you mentioned, is critical not only to possibly this election, but so many communities where that's their only form of delivery at all. So
that's right. Ironically, Chris, for my Republican friends, the communities that would be hit the hardest and worst if something happened to the Postal Service in terms of interruption of delivery or actually elimination of some service would be rural America, Republican America.
That's right. Yeah. All right, let's jump into another question here. This is from Adam. Are there any plans, going back to the economic impact we were talking about before, are there any plans for longer-term assistance to small businesses, assuming that this crisis continues for at least the next 6 to 9 months? And to that, I would add, if it goes even beyond that, how long, and the federal government continues to be the funder, I guess, of the country, how long can that go on without breaking the bank, really?
Well, I guess that's an unanswerable question in some ways, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it depends. I mean, if the pandemic lasts for years, there are going to be obvious limits to how much further intervention can occur.
Sure.
Right now, the chairman of the Federal Reserve has basically told Congress, don't worry about deficits right now, worry about magnitude, go big. And he's following his own advice. So far, the Fed's intervention in the economy during this pandemic totals in excess of $3 trillion. And they expect to get up to 5 or 6 to try to save things and stabilize things. They're going into the bond market and buying up bonds, and they're expanding the list of bonds that they historically have never played in those markets, including state and local government bonding. Congress, as you saw, remarkably put aside traditional ideological fights about size and scope of federal intervention and budgets and appropriations. And last week when we passed the interim bill, which was $420 billion, which normally would be considered a huge bill, but compared to 2.2 trillion, it was an afterthought for some people. But that bill passed with 393 members of the House present and voting. Only 5 voted no. And you almost have to pitch yourself like, are we really doing this on such an overwhelming bipartisan nature? So I think Republicans really got scared when they saw that the president and many in their party had miscalculated about the nature of this threat and the economic fallout being so enormous. And they realized that if they don't respond to this with the programs we're proposing at hand, they not only risk their own political demise, but their communities
Right.
be a long time recovering, if ever. And so I think they finally got a dose of progressive reality, if you will, that
You mean common sense?
Yeah, massive federal intervention in a Keynesian way is what is called for. And all of a sudden, all those old, conservative shibboleths about limiting the size and scope of government and let the private sector do it and all that went out the window. And so in some ways, it took a pandemic to help people get religion. Now, we'll see how long lasting that is. And my guess is we're going to have a bigger fight over the next bill than the other previous 4. But I think we've got some leverage to try to shape that bill in a more progressive fashion.
Okay, that's great. It's great to hear that there can be a foundation of cooperation regarding some of these issues. Just getting back to Adam's question real quick. So he's asking about longer term assistance to businesses beyond what's happening right now, and then say 6 to 9 months down the road. So from what you're saying, the other side kind of coming around on the need for some of these measures, is it safe to assume that the Congress will just keep attacking this bit by bit as we go forward? And if so, are there specific plans that are in the works right now that might come to fruition weeks or months down the road?
So everything we've been doing right now is for immediate relief to stabilize and save and staunch. But as we move forward in time, we're going to have to look to that question, David's question. We're going to have to look at recovery institutions, right? And they're longer perforce. They're longer in nature, and they're going to be from my point of view, multi-year kinds of commitments with very low cost loans, maybe in some cases also forgivable, to help businesses get back on their feet and hire people back. That's a very big part of the Democratic concern, obviously. So yeah, I don't know exactly what those institutions are going to look like, but they're going to have to be there. And the one thing we do have going for us, going back to your earlier question, but it relates to this one too, is cost of money. So with the cost of money at Federal Reserve loan rates almost at zero, if the federal government's gonna go in debt and borrow money, this is a great time to do it.
Yeah.
If we were dealing with say late 1970, early 1980 kind of money, frankly, this would be very, very difficult. It's going to add a lot to the debt, but we can't take a Herbert Hoover kind of approach here where going into debt is the worst of all things. The worst of all things is allowing this economic collapse to get steeper and steeper without any intervention.
Sure. Okay. Next question from Michael. Where are we on aid to state and local governments? Leadership at the federal level is desperately lacking, so the governors have taken the lead. How and when do you see us helping them?
Yeah, as you know, I come from local government. I spent 14 years in local government, 5 as the chairman of the county. And I know local government finances very well. I know the relationship between the state and localities and the federal government. And I am passionate about this subject. So there is no question that state and local government relief is going to be in the next bill. Now, background. In the big CARES Act, the $2.2 trillion bill we passed, originally the Republicans had $0, zero, for state and local governments. At Democratic insistence, we got $150 billion. The Republicans, however, insisted that, okay, if we give you that, that money has to be restricted to COVID-19 related expenses strictly. Now, if you know anything about local governments, look, I may have a nursing home that we run that needs PPE and extra help and quarantine and all kinds of expenses we weren't counting on, and I've got to move resources from here to there. That $150 billion should have been flexible enough for me to then plug the hole where I moved that money from. Because I still got first responders I got to make sure are trained and paid for. I got to run medical clinics and schools and trash pickup and water and roads and bridges, you name it. Remember that localities are actually where it happens. In local government officials actually have to do something. They actually have to implement programs, build things, make things run and work. They hire men and women to do these jobs that are critical and we take for granted. The largest single employer in America is state and local government. 13% of the entire American workforce are state and local government employees. And I'm not even counting the contractors they contract with to, excuse me, I dropped my candle over.
Hopefully it's okay.
It's totally fine, thank God. To say nothing of the small businesses and contractors they outsource with as well. So huge impact on the economy. And to have Mitch McConnell say, well, I don't want to provide them any more money, I think they should go bankrupt. Now, put aside the fact that most state and local governments are by law prohibited from filing for bankruptcy, and put aside the fact that were they to follow his advice, the bond market in America would collapse and probably not recover for generations. To say nothing of massive unemployment additions to the already 30 million Americans looking for work. And vital services collapsing in America, right? You take that water that when you turn the faucet, you take that for granted, the water's going to come out and it's pure and clean, unless you're in Flint, Michigan. And Flint, Michigan is an object lesson in what can go wrong with a vital human ingredient for life that we take for granted that all of a sudden poison people because the local system at state insistence transferred its water supply and it turned out to be toxic. And they're going to be a long time recovering from that. So state and local governments are essential. That and the Postal Service, for me, are two things that must be in the next bill, must be. And there has to be flexibility as to how they use those resources to plug revenue holes. Now, the final point, if you look at Northern Virginia, I would say that collectively for Northern Virginia governments, non-real estate tax revenue is about $1 billion from very few sources, because we don't have a lot of sources, but transit occupancy tax, B-poll tax, meals tax if you got it, and that's about $1 billion. And all of those sources, right, are drying up. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to restaurants. There's no meals tax. Transit occupancy tax, no one's going to hotels. And B-poll, all of our small businesses pretty much are shut down. So that's a huge burden on them on the revenue side. Meanwhile, their expenses are higher in many ways, right? And they're going to have to make more investments in technology. Take their school systems. They've got to have a more robust ability to do remote learning and education. We saw what happened in Fairfax County with the crash not once but twice of the dashboard technology, frustrating 190,000 students in the 10th largest school district in America. What could go wrong with that? Sure. So we're putting a lot of burden on state and local governments, and we have an absolute obligation from a federal point of view to plug revenue holes where we can, shore them up, stabilize them, and avoid mass layoffs of their employees.
Okay. Let's shift gears real quick here. We got an international question. You mentioned China before. You mentioned that we should not have become so dependent on China for healthcare items needed to deal with COVID-19. Patrick is asking, are there other strategic items we should try to free ourselves from a dependence on China? If so, do you have ideas on how we might do that?
Yeah, this is also going to be a long-term project, but we learned the weakness of being so overly dependent in your supply chain on one or two countries. And we definitely saw that with PPE and incubators and the like. Now, I'll give the other issue is drugs. 80%, it is said, of antibiotics consumed in America come from China, or the ingredients come from China. Wow. 80%. And my favorite question: what could go wrong with that?
Sure.
And while we've got a president who's picking fights with China every other day in trade and in the South China Sea, some of them legit, but you're risking that relationship, the reliability of that relationship on an economic as well as a military front. And so I think we've definitely got to pursue a policy where we have a multiplicity of suppliers. We're not overly dependent on any one, and we have some clear capability domestically for drug development and vaccine development and medical supply manufacturing.
And do you see a path toward that? I mean, are we on our way to that?
I do. We had a conference call like this with FDA the other day. And one of the promises we've got is in advanced manufacturing techniques. And that capability is largely here in the United States. It needs to be ramped up, but it has a lot of advantages. Better quality control, but also the ability to ramp up and mass produce. And if and when we have a breakthrough in a vaccine for this virus, having a quick capability to ramp up manufacturing in the millions, right, of doses very rapidly is going to be critical. So investing more in advanced manufacturing here in the United States, I think has a lot of promise, but we got to make those investments.
Sure. All right. I want to come back to the PPP again. So one of the challenges that small businesses have had is that 75% of the PPP money needs to go to payroll and benefits. And some of these businesses are saying, well, we're only 3 or 5 or 10 people, so we're not spending a ton of money on payroll, but we do have these other fixed costs, and only having 25% of the money be allowed to be allocated to those is a little upside down in certain ways. Is that, are congressional members, your colleagues, are they talk about those types of things with regard to ironing out these issues in future legislation?
Yeah. Again, some of this is about the urgency and immediacy of putting together these pieces of legislation. The other thing is we're doing it kind of remotely, right? So even though there's a lot of input for, like we have multiple caucus conference calls every week. And prior to writing the CARES Act, I submitted pieces of legislation for that bill on postal, on state and local government, on protecting inspectors general, on federal employees. I actually wrote parts of that bill from my subcommittee, and other committees and subcommittees were doing the same. And then we talked about it at great length in terms of this, that, or the other. But at the end of the day, there were only 5 people in the room. You know that song from Hamilton, I want to be there. I want to be in the room where it happens. Well, most of us want to. I
haven't been able to get tickets yet, but I will keep that in mind for when I do.
For Father's Day 2 years ago, I got my wife and daughter got me tickets, and we loved it. But that song is my favorite. I want to be there. I want to be in the room where it happens, because you can really relate to that. And in this case, I can really relate to this. So 5 people basically decided what was in and out. And they were, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy in the House, and Steve Mnuchin from the White House. And those 5 basically had life and death decisions about what survived or didn't in the bill. That's not a satisfying process. It was a necessary one at the time because we weren't meeting because of the pandemic, but it means that you have limited numbers of voices going, wait a minute. And sometimes, not everybody knows how it works.
Sure.
Not everybody in Congress worked in the private sector. I spent 20 years in the private sector. Not everyone in Congress, in fact, most members of Congress never served in local government. I did, but most of them come from the state legislature. So they have a perspective, but it's a legislative perspective, not necessarily a pragmatic, how does it work perspective. And sometimes we're hamstrung by that because the wrong questions get asked or the right questions don't get asked. So with respect to this particular example, obviously the intent was to prevent layoffs, to minimize the unemployment claims, to keep people with paychecks, their families whole, keep them on health insurance if they had it, to stabilize things and give companies an incentive to do that. Now, so that's a good intention, but I don't think it was foreseen that well. But if I only have 3 or 4 or 5 employees, and I'm willing, if we can find a way that, okay, I'm going to keep them, but I'd like more flexibility in the rest of the money to pay for, loans, my rent, supplies, whatever it may be. I think we need to be flexible about that.
Okay.
What we don't want is somebody coming in saying, well, I want to use that money for other purposes while I'm laying people off. I won't name him, but I've got one CEO who represents a big chain, and he's unbelievable. He wants to keep his loan till after the crisis to invest it in other things while he's laying off most of his workers at his chain. And I'm thinking, well, that flies in the face of the whole purpose of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
I might add, of course, he's a big Republican who, has supported very right-wing candidates and doesn't believe in government except now for him.
Funny how that works out, right? Question from Jane in Alexandria about the future of white-collar workers in Northern Virginia. So it seems like a lot of the challenges right now we're seeing immediately at restaurants and small retailers, but in terms of the service industry, it's a great question because you've got a lot of lawyers, professional services people. These people are taking up office space. What is the future of white-collar businesses, you think, over the next 6 months, 12 months, and beyond?
Well, I guess we're always going to need lawyers. Look, there are going to be some casualties in the white collar workforce, and depending on how hollowed out the economy is, as we were talking earlier, if state and local governments take a hit, they're going to lay people off, including white collar professionals, managers. And frankly, if the federal government takes such a hit that it's going to be wounded for a long time, potentially it could even affect the federal employee workforce and the contract outsourcing workforce as well. But having said that, I think you're probably going to see the white collar, I'm just guessing, but just when I think about what we're going to need in recovery, we're going to need a lot of programs to help virtually every sector of the economy to recover. We're going to have to beef up public health infrastructure. We're going to have to find ways to run big recovery programs to help small businesses and medium-sized and even big industries recover from this catastrophic event that could be years in the making, right? So I wouldn't predict some mass loss of white collar jobs. It depends on what you do and where you are. Mm-hmm. Some areas are going to fare better. Some areas are going to probably grow pretty rapidly. So I think it's a little too early to say, but I certainly wouldn't predict something dire for white collar professionals.
Well, that's good. Definitely good news. All right, we are running a little low on time, so we're going to try and get to one, maybe two more questions. Anne is asking about 2020. Will Trump's performance or lack of performance regarding the coronavirus crisis stick as a messaging item in the 2020 election, and how might that come about?
I'm only speaking for myself, and God knows I got 2016 wrong, so I stipulate that. But generally speaking, I think I've been pretty good in political predictions when I make them. I think this election, even with the pandemic, has been set for a long time. A majority of Americans don't like Donald Trump and don't want him in the White House and don't want him reelected. That has not changed. That's been very steady for almost 3 years. And of that 52 or 53% that don't want him reelected, a very high percentage of that is very intense. I really mean it. I can't stand him. I want him gone. I think he's, whatever. Nothing's changed. So he had a little bit of a bounce in the middle of this pandemic, and it collapsed. Right. And he's now back to rock bottom approval numbers, including his approval for handling this. And if anyone needed to anchor the image of an incompetent and out of control, maybe a little unhinged, more than a little, president who should be leading but isn't, when he talked about ingesting disinfectants as maybe a cure for this, anyone who's sentient had to be really deeply troubled by what kind of mind is behind that kind of public speculation about. I mean, that goes beyond quackery. That's downright dangerous, right?
Yeah.
He's the president of the United States, all but encouraging Americans to do something that will jeopardize their lives and health. Right. If you're a parent, you need to block your children's eyes and ears from listening or seeing that.
So is it your sense that his performance or lack of performance is setting in? So that if you're a leader, in some ways you kind of crave a crisis, right? It's a chance to shine. It's a chance to do well. He obviously has not, and so. Is it your belief that is resonating with, we'll call them persuadable voters across the country? I believe
it is. And again, I'm not sure even persuadable voters will make a difference. I think this election's been set for a long time. And we just need to get our vote out if we're going to win. Now, if you look at state by state, I'd much rather be where we are than he is. So essentially, the so-called blue wall is intact.
Mm-hmm.
We're ahead in the 3 states we lost: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's the most squishy. But if you look at the results of the Wisconsin primary, where we won a special election for the Supreme Court, they're pretty reassuring. She won by 11 points. Democrats don't win statewide races for Supreme Court by 11 points. In fact, generally they lose those elections.
Sure.
So a powerful statement. And we're almost tied in Ohio. We're a little bit ahead in Florida. We're very competitive in North Carolina, and we're only 4 or 5 points behind in Texas. He's in trouble. As long as we don't, mess up, I think we're headed for a fairly decisive election this November.
And again, it only happens if people actually show up.
That's right. Everyone's got to vote.
Everybody's got to vote.
I don't think, if you look at the results of elections since he was inaugurated, including especially here in Virginia, this isn't speculation anymore. It's not, flawed polls. It's actual results.
Mm-hmm.
And until the pandemic hit, we were looking in most Democratic primary states at record turnouts. And where you look at election results, very heartening. Democrats are winning all over the place where they shouldn't be, including in Trump-carried districts. That's how we won the House last year, or in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Virginia, I would say 2017 essentially was a realigning election for Virginia. And Northern Virginia is lost. Where you are in Roanoke, we're still fighting. But, and you look at the consolidation in Enrico and Chesterfield, suburban Richmond, and then you look at what's happening down at Norfolk and Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach. I'd much rather be a Democrat looking to the future of Virginia than a Republican.
Absolutely. All right. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Medical question. So this question comes from Erica, and it relates to healthcare. Coronavirus has shown how expensive it is to have massive layoffs and workers losing employer-sponsored health insurance during a pandemic. Do you see a path to universal healthcare in America as a result of this?
Yes, I do. And I think we should have a path to that. This shows you the fragility of the system. Here we are in a pandemic and people are worried. I'm not getting tested or not going to the hospital because they're afraid of the cost. Other countries aren't facing that barrier, but we are because of our fractured healthcare system. And so I think a whole reexamination of how we provide healthcare in America and who has access to it is in the cards. The fact that the pandemic, the virus, has disproportionately affected minority communities, especially the African American community, really highlights the inequality in access to healthcare that exists in America, persists, and that's clearly not an acceptable thing. And I think that's going to force a really profound reevaluation about the whole healthcare system in America. And I think hopefully politically reopens the discussion for a lot of Americans who hid behind, or I shouldn't say hid behind, but they love the mantra of leave my healthcare alone and I love my private insurance and blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, it's great unless you lose it.
Sure.
And in all cases, by the way, it's not even great. I think definitely, there are going to be some things that change after this pandemic. We talked about voting, how we vote. I predict voting by mail is absolutely in our future. It may not be 100%, but we're moving in that direction very rapidly. And I think that would be a good thing for democracy if we manage it correctly, because I think we can make it easier for people to vote. I think a reexamination of our healthcare system and the assumptions that underlie it is absolutely in our future.
All right. Well, that's good to hear, and we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Lots more coming down the pike from a medical standpoint, and remains to be seen the full impact of this crisis and the lingering health effects that may force some of these changes that you're talking about. Congressman Gerry Connolly, thank you so much for joining us. You know, we here at DemBiz, you're you're a business guy historically, and one thing that we always try and put out there is that Democrats kind of take a three-dimensional view of business and create a more stable and sustainable environment for it. And I think that right now we're seeing the benefit of having infrastructure in place, having a government that works, because businesses are really being hit hard. So your feedback here is much appreciated, as is your work on Capitol Hill. Really appreciate you taking some time out this morning to talk with us.
Chris, thank you. And I'm going to end with an ad. Remember, I've got a primary on June 23rd. If you want to help, go to my campaign website. Would love to have it.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you all for joining us. We'll have more programming coming up in the upcoming weeks, and we'll talk with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, how many we have on?